The sound came first, not applause, not music. A dry, splitting crack, wood tearing under weight it was never meant to hold, followed by a scream that didn't end when the bodies stopped moving. People later said the scream lingered in the rafters, clinging to the iron beams like breath on cold glass. Bone met floor somewhere below the lights. Someone shouted a name, someone prayed, someone vomited. And above it all, the rigging swayed gently, still alive, still hungry, as if nothing had gone wrong at all. They would call it an accident. They always do. 15 minutes earlier, there had been no blood, no broken necks, no paralysis waiting to stretch across a lifetime. There had only been a photograph, a quiet moment frozen in silver nitrate, 7 figures standing on a narrow platform, suspended 40 feet above a theater floor that smelled of sawdust and old perfume. A family balanced between gravity and belief, smiling the way people smile when they have already agreed not to look down. That photograph still exists. It survives because paper remembers what people try to forget. Look closely, and the image begins to resist you. The ropes are there, but not quite where they show. B. One hand grips too lightly, another avoids the cable altogether. A wrist disappears into shadow, wrapped in cloth that was never meant to be seen. A woman's posture is wrong, too careful, too guarded. Her body carrying a secret that would have ended her place in the air if it had been spoken aloud. The distance between them is subtle, almost polite, but fatal. A human pyramid does not forgive. E-space. Before we go any further, pause for a moment. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? The photograph was taken in Detroit in the autumn of 1900, when the city was still learning what kind of machine it wanted to become. Smoke from factories drifted over brick streets. Immigrants slept 4 to a room and called it opportunity. Entertainment was cheap, bodies were. Cheaper, and danger was part of the price of admission. The Wonderland theater rose from the street like a promise. Electric lights, steel beams, and a rigging system that management swore was modern, safe, and strong enough to carry anything that dared to trust it. The family in the photograph had crossed an ocean to stand there. German hands, old country discipline, a lineage built on balance and obedience, passed from father to son like a curse disguised as tradition. They were known for precision, for silence, for never falling. 3 generations trained to believe that fear was a weakness and pain was a private matter. What the crowd saw as courage was often just necessity wearing a brave face. Behind the smiles, debts were accumulating like mold in the walls. Bookings were disape, airing. Newer acts were louder, bloodier, more spectacular. Precision no longer paid what it once had. The theater contract in Detroit was not just another performance. It was rent, it was food, it was survival dressed up as spectacle. And somewhere between the camera shutter and the sound of splintering wood, a decision had already been made. The photograph doesn't show it, but it knows. Detroit. At the turn of the century was a place that pretended not to look back. Streets were renamed, neighborhoods shifted, old boarding houses swallowed secrets the way soil swallows bone. But if you traced the city through its forgotten maps and municipal ledgers, you could still find the outline of the Wonderland Theater penciled into the margins like a warning no one heeded. The building sat just far enough from the river to avoid the worst floods, just close enough to the rail lines to drink in crowds hungry for distraction. Inside, the air was always warm, heavy with oil smoke and anticipation. The rigging above the stage was a lattice of steel and rope, newly installed, proudly advertised, and quietly flawed. Engineers wrote reports. Owners buried them. Paper has always been easier to sigh. Lents than people. The family arrived weeks before the performance, carrying trunks that smelled of leather, chalk, and old sweat. They lodged in a narrow boarding house where the walls were thin and the landlord counted days instead of months. Arguments traveled easily there, so did whispers. Other performers noticed the tension immediately. This was not the calm, clockwork unit the posters promised. Something had shifted. The patriarch ruled by routine, meals at the same hour, practice at the same hour, silence when he demanded it. He believed order was the only thing that kept gravity from remembering its power. His sons had grown beneath that discipline, bones shaped by repetition, thoughts trimmed to fit the needs of the act. Questioning was a luxury. Disobedience was dangerous. Cheech. Youngest had been born into the air. He learned to balance before he learned to read. The platform felt more familiar than solid ground. People said he had no fear, but that was not true. He had simply learned to hide it early, the way children in rigid households often do, by becoming exactly what was expected of them. Detroit watched from a distance. Locals knew circus families rarely stayed L. They burned bright, spent fast, and vanished before the bills came due. But there were rumors even then. Late-night practices that ran too long. Raised voices echoing in the theater when it should have been empty. A woman slipping away from meals, pale and careful, hands always resting protectively at her midsection. Church records from the district list the family only briefly, names writ in ink that fades faster than memory. No baptisms recorded that autumn, no blessings. It was as if even the clergy sensed something unstable moving through their parish, something better left undocumented. The night before the performance, the weather turned. Wind rattled loose signs. Rain crept into seams it didn't belong in. One of the riggers reportedly suggested postponement. He was overruled. Ed. The theater needed its audience. The family needed its payment. Everyone agreed to pretend the sky was irrelevant. In the boarding house, a light burned late. Papers were spread across a small table. Ledgers, letters, calculations, written and rewritten. A man paced. A woman wrote to someone far away, choosing her words carefully, omitting what could not be forgiven. In another room, a younger man wrapped his wrist tighter than before, testing his grip against the edge of a chair, wincing when pain reminded him of its limits. By morning, the decision felt irreversible. The city was awake, the theater doors opened, and the photograph waited to be taken. The child had been shaped by height. From his earliest memory, the ground was something distant and unreliable, a place you passed through. All but never trusted. He was born during a traveling season, his first cries swallowed by canvas and wagon wheels, his infancy measured not in months but in towns. By the time he could walk, he already knew how to fall without breaking. By the time he could speak, he understood which questions earned silence. They said he was gifted. That word followed him like a shadow. Gifted meant useful. Gifted meant pressure disguised as praise. His small hands learned the language of rope and skin, the difference between a grip that holds and one that lies. He watched his elders closely, absorbing their habits, their fears, their unspoken rules. He learned that love was conditional, granted when the pyramid held and withdrawn when it wavered. At 16, he was too young to understand the full weight of what he carried, but old enough to feel it pressing down on his chest at night. He dreamed of falling long before it happened. Not the fall itself, but the moment before, the stillness when the body realizes there is nothing left to rely on. He woke from those dreams with his heart racing, convinced he had already died once and was living on borrowed time. The family told stories about blow. Odd lines the way others told fairy tales. Great-grandfathers who had never fallen. Ancestors who had crossed borders with nothing but their balance and their name. The lineage mattered. It was spoken of with reverence, but also with fear. To fail was not just personal. It was hereditary shame. He was paired early with the others, placed where his lightness and agility could compensate for heavier bodies above him. No one asked if he wanted that role. Wanting was irrelevant. He belonged to the structure now, a living support beam expected to hold without complaint. When his arms trembled, he learned to still them. When his mind questioned, he learned to silence it. There were moments when he seemed older than his years. He noticed glances others pretended not to see. He sensed tension before. Voices rose. He understood that the new woman in the family carried more than ambition, and that the man who claimed her carried anger just beneath his skin. Children raised in precarious environments often develop this awareness. Survival sharpens perception. In private he sketched. Not landscapes or animals, but shapes. Interlocking bodies, lines under strain, figures suspended over empty space. Some drawings showed gaps where hands should meet. Others showed ropes fraying, fibers separating one by one. He never showed these to anyone. He folded them carefully and hid them among his clothes, as if they might betray him if left exposed. The adults told him he was ready for the higher position, that his promotion was proof of trust. He nodded, proud and afraid in equal measure. He did not say that his wrists ached from overuse. He did not say that the man below him had begun to hesitate, just for a fraction of a second, before committing his full weight. In the air, fractions mattered. On the day of the performance he ate very little. His stomach felt hollow, as if preparing itself for absence. When the photographer asked them to hold still, he did. He stood exactly where he was told. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet certainty settled in, a knowledge without language that whatever came next could not be stopped. The hours leading up to the performance moved with an unnatural slowness, as if time itself were reluctant to reach what it already knew was waiting. Backstage, the air smelled of resin and damp rope. Hands were chalked and re-chalked until skin cracked. Ever. Movement was rehearsed, but not every thought could be controlled. Symbols began to appear where none had been before. Knots tied and retied in unfamiliar patterns. A length of rope coiled clockwise instead of counter. Someone whispered a prayer learned in childhood, words meant to protect travelers from falls and fires, words that had not been spoken aloud in years. Superstition flourishes where certainty collapses. The child watched closely. He noticed how the adults avoided certain topics, how conversations stopped when he entered the room. He sensed that knowledge was being withheld, not to protect him, but to preserve a fragile agreement among those who believed they still had choices. His role was to perform, not to understand. Strange sounds carried through the theater as the audience gathered. Not the roar of a crowd, but something lower, a collective murmur, restless and hungry. The building itself responded, metal contracting and expanding, beams creaking under the accumulated weight of bodies and expectations. High above the stage, the rigging waited, already compromised, already strained. During the final practice, something went wrong. A grip slipped for less than a heartbeat. No one fell, no one spoke, but eyes met, and fear moved between them like a current. The man with the bandaged wrist clenched his jaw, insisting it was nothing. Pain has a way of making liars out of the proud. The woman stood apart, breathing carefully, counting movements, calculating how to conceal the tremor that came and went without warning. She pressed a hand against her abdomen. When she thought no one was looking, grounding herself against a truth that could not be shared. In that era, pregnancy was not weakness, but it was treated as liability. Her body was already betraying expectations imposed upon it. The child felt something else, an inversion of roles. He sensed that the adults were no longer fully in control, that authority had begun to fracture under pressure. He saw it in the patriarch's eyes, in the way certainty had thinned into stubbornness. He saw it in the younger man's restless movements, the way his injured hand hovered near critical connections longer than necessary. Animals died that afternoon in the alley behind the theater. Stray cats, found stiff and silent, throats unmarked. Some said poison, others said accident. No one connected it to the performance, but later, those who studied the family's papers would note the coincidence. In folklore, such deaths are warnings. In reality, they are often ignored. As the hour approached, the child's sense of dislocation intensified. He felt older, heavier, as if carrying not just his own weight, but the accumulated failures of generations. The drawings he had hidden came back to him unbidden. Gap. Frayed lines, empty space where hands should meet. He wondered briefly if drawings could be prophetic, or if they were merely the mind's way of rehearsing disaster. When they were called to the platform, he climbed without hesitation. The height did not frighten him. What frightened him was the silence between instructions, the unspoken understanding that something had already been set in motion. The photograph was taken then, a moment of stillness, 7 figures suspended between intention and consequence. Below them, the crowd waited. The truth did not announce itself all at once. It never does. It surfaced in fragments, in pauses that lingered too long, in the way certain names were never spoken aloud. Families that survive on secrecy learn how to fold reality until it fits inside. Acceptable shapes. Over time, the folds become permanent. The child had grown up calling everyone by titles rather than names. Father, uncle, brother. Words that carried authority but concealed origin. What he did not know, what no one intended him to know, was that the family tree had long since collapsed inward, its branches looping back into the same dark soil. Marriages arranged for continuity, rather than love. Bloodlines preserved not out of pride, but fear of dilution. Outsiders were temporary, kin was forever. The woman who stood on the platform that night was not just his protector in the air. She had been woven into his life since infancy, present at meals, at practices, at whispered arguments behind closed doors. Her affection had been constant, intense, and confusing. When he was younger, he mistook it for maternal care. As he grew older, the boundaries blurred in ways that left him disoriented and ashamed, unable to articulate what felt wrong because nothing in his world had taught him a different shape for love. Church records from previous towns tell the story obliquely. Births registered without fathers, surnames repeated too often across generations, a quiet unders, standing between clergy and circus families, that some questions were better left unanswered. In itinerant communities, stability often masquerades as virtue, even when it is built on repetition that corrodes the soul. The child had sensed the distortion long before he understood it. He felt it in the way arguments carried a personal venom, in the way loyalty was demanded without explanation. He felt it most acutely in his own body, in reactions he could not control, in guilt that arrived before desire had fully formed. He learned early that silence was safer than curiosity. On the night of the performance, these buried truths pressed closer to the surface. The woman's condition was no longer just her secret. It was a manifestation of the family's refusal to break from itself. A future bay. NG formed from a past that had never been allowed to end. The men argued in coded language, invoking honor and necessity while avoiding the real source of their fear. That exposure would mean collapse long before any pyramid did. The man with the injured wrist knew. He had discovered the full extent of the family's entanglements days earlier, and the knowledge had settled into him like rot. His care was not just about injury or money. It was about inheritance, about realizing that the structure he had devoted his life to was fundamentally unsound, built on compromises that no amount of skill could redeem. The child stood between them all, unaware of the specific words but keenly aware of the weight they carried. When he took his position, he was not just supporting bodies, he was supporting a history that had fed on itself for too long. Above him, below him, around him, the family tightened its grip, trying to hold together what should have been allowed to fall generations earlier. The first movement of the pyramid began, and with it, the truth strained against gravity. When the structure failed, it did not do so violently at first. There was no dramatic snap, no singular moment the crowd could point to and say, "There." Instead, the collapse unfolded like a slow confession. A tremor passed through the bodies, a shift of weight, a pause where instinct begged for correction and found none. The man with the injured wrist loosened his grip exactly as planned. What he did not anticipate was how much the rigging had already been weakened, how little margin remained between Bala, NCE, and annihilation. The ropes groaned, fibers separating with a sound like breath being pulled from lungs. The child felt the change immediately. His arms burned, his footing slipped. He opened his mouth to warn them, but the noise of the crowd swallowed whatever sound escaped. Gravity finished what secrecy had begun. Bodies struck wood and metal in rapid succession. One impact echoed hollow. Final. Another ended in a sound too soft to be survival. The woman screamed, not in fear but in recognition, her voice breaking into something raw and animal as she fell. When it was over, the pyramid no longer existed, only limbs at impossible angles, blood darkening the stage, silence expanding outward until it filled the theater completely. The crowd did not rush forward at first. People rarely do. They sat frozen, suspended between horror and disbelief, waiting for authority to tell them what they were seeing. Ushers shouted. Someone rang for a doctor. Someone else ran for the exit, retching as they went. The patriarch survived the fall. He lay among his family, conscious, staring upward at the rigging he had trusted for decades. Witnesses later said he tried to speak, but no words for med. His eyes tracked the ropes as they swayed gently, indifferent now that their work was done. By morning, the narrative had already begun to harden. Newspapers spoke of tragic miscalculation, equipment failure, the risks inherent in aerial performance. Language smoothed the edges, turned human choices into mechanical inevitability. Names were printed. Context was not. The town responded, the towns often do when confronted with something that threatens to implicate them. They distanced themselves. The boarding house owner burned the family's discarded belongings behind the building, claiming sanitation concerns. Neighbors crossed themselves when passing the site, as if contamination lingered in the air. Children were warned not to speak of what they had seen. The church held a service that avoided specifics. Sin was mentioned, but abstractly. Suffering was framed as trial rather than consequence. Records from that parish show an unusual number of entries crossed out or left incomplete in the weeks that followed. Entire pages removed. Animals were killed in quiet acts of superstition. Pets that had been near the theater were destroyed. Stray dogs disappeared. It was not punishment so much as cleansing. A community attempting to erase the sense that something unnatural had been allowed to happen in their presence. The house where the survivors recovered was later condemned and demolished, officially for structural reasons, unofficially because no one wanted to live where grief had settled so heavily into the walls. By winter, the family was go. Nay, scattered, their story reduced to rumor and half-remembered caution. But the ground does not forget weight, and neither does history. For nearly 80 years, the story lay dormant, sealed beneath polite phrasing and institutional indifference. It survived only as a footnote in circus histories and a cautionary anecdote told by older performers who lowered their voices when they reached the end. The photograph remained, but without context it was harmless, a curiosity, a frozen moment emptied of consequence. That changed in the late 1980s when a woman with no connection to the circus began tracing her family's past through county archives and church basements. She was not looking for tragedy. She was looking for continuity. Names, dates, migrations, the ordinary scaffolding of answers. Try. What she found instead were absences that repeated too precisely to be accidental. Birth certificates with missing fathers. Marriage records that circled the same surnames, children registered in towns where no adults of that name officially resided. Each inconsistency could be explained away on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that refused to stay buried. She followed the paper trail to Detroit. Municipal records led her to a defunct theater and a boarded-up archive scheduled for renovation. Inside, dust-coated boxes held forgotten maintenance logs, insurance correspondence, and a single envelope marked only with a date. October, 1900. Inside was the photograph. She had seen it before in books, but never like this. The original print revealed details reproductions had eras. The bandage, the distance between bodies. The way one young face seemed not proud, but resigned. She began to cross-reference the image with hospital records, death notices, and unpublished reporters' notes stored on microfilm. The official story unraveled quickly. What took longer was the family itself. She located private letters in a Midwestern historical society, donated by a descendant, who had not read them. The handwriting was careful, controlled, and saturated with fear. Mentions of debts, of rules, of a pregnancy described only in euphemism, and beneath it all a persistent avoidance of lineage, as if naming relationships too precisely might summon consequences. The most disturbing discovery came from a set of taped interviews recorded in the early 1950s by a folklorist Cole, seating stories from retired circus workers. One voice, aged and trembling, spoke of a family that folded in on itself, of children who did not know where affection ended and obligation began, of a fall that was not entirely an accident. DNA testing was still crude, but enough samples remained among the descendants to confirm what the documents implied. The genetic markers repeated in ways that could not occur across so few generations. The family tree did not branch, it spiraled. When the researcher attempted to publish her findings, resistance was immediate. Institutions cited liability. Museums questioned relevance. Descendants asked her to stop. Some offered money, others offered silence. She refused both. The photograph was displayed publicly for the first time with its full Conti XT attached. Visitors stood longer than expected. Some left early. Others returned more than once, as if trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been taught about progress, entertainment, and choice. The past had been patient. Now it was speaking. The final resistance did not come from institutions. It came from families. Letters arrived at the researcher's home in unmarked envelopes. Some were pleading, written in careful language that asked her to consider the harm of reopening old wounds. Others were furious, accusing her of manufacturing shame where none had existed. A few were incoherent, filled with religious invocations and threats that shifted abruptly into apology. What united them was fear, not of being wrong, but of being seen. In one letter, a woman wrote that her grandmother had refused mirrors, covering them with cloth whenever guests arrived. Another described a grandfather who insisted children never sleep alone, not out of kindness, but vigilance. Patterns emerged. Trauma had not ended with the fall. It had migrated, adapted, embedded itself in behavior passed down without explanation. The researcher published anyway. Public reaction was uneven. Some dismissed the findings as sensationalism. Others recognized echoes of their own histories in the documentation, the way secrecy masquerades as protection, the way silence corrodes across generations. Survivor accounts from other traveling families began to surface, confirming that what had happened was not isolated. It was structural. An industry built on spectacle had relied on blood and compliance, rewarding those who endured and discarding those who broke. The last living descendant directly connected to the fall was interviewed shortly before his death. Confined to a wheelchair for most of his life, he spoke slowly, choosing words with care. He said he had always known the story he was told was incomplete, that accidents do not leave that kind of silence behind. He described dreams of falling that never stopped, of hands slipping away no matter how tightly he reached. When asked why he never spoke publicly, he answered simply, because no one had asked in a way that allowed truth. After the exhibition closed, the photograph returned to storage, but it did not disappear. Copies circulated, academic papers cited it. The story entered the quiet places where history waits to be re-examined. The house where the survivors recovered was long gone. But the ground still bore scars detectable in soil surveys, a density where ash and bone had once mixed. Nothing was undone. That is not how this works. The dead remained dead. The injured carried their damage into old age. The family name faded, then resurfaced in unexpected places, always accompanied by gaps and corrections. The photograph endures because it captures more than a moment before death. It captures a system at its breaking point. A family shaped by obligation until obligation became violence. A child standing in the center of a structure he never chose, holding up secrets that should have ended generations earlier. So ask yourself quietly, without looking away, what would you do if you discovered your safety depended on silence? What would you do if the people who raised you had also trapped you? And what would you do if you realized, too late, that the fall was never an accident, but an inheritance? The photograph does not answer. It only waits.